Nighthead. Welcome to this presentation on Indigenous Religions. This presentation is part of the University of Mississippi High School course on World Religions. In this presentation, we're going to cover Indigenous Religions, get a working definition of what that means, learn what Indigenous religions have in common with each other, and we're also going to focus on a few that are around the world. So let's get started. Indigenous religions. Well, first off, we need to look at the word indigenous. Indigenous means original to the area. To help you with that definition, think about this. A banjo. It's indigenous to the United States. What else is indigenous? Well, think about a kiwi. No, not that kiwi. This kiwi. That kiwi is indigenous to where? To New Zealand. So now that you have a pretty good grasp of indigenous, think about what it means when it talks about a religion. Because technically all religions are indigenous to a particular area because, well, they tend to either gather up speed or start at a certain place, and, well, every religion is has a particular locale about it. So what exactly do we mean when we say it's indigenous? We must be implying something different. When you hear the word indigenous when it comes to religions, many times people are talking about a religion that's simple or not as much constructs when it comes to formalities, but it doesn't always mean that. Also, indigenous sometimes is used alongside of animism or nature worship. So let's try to find out a little bit more about what that means. Well, first off, indigenous religions, most of them are very, very old. If they're very, very old, many of them were going to outdate, well, the alphabet for that language. So before spelling test, these religions existed. Okay, so these religions rely on stories that are passed down. These stories may be represented in pictures, they might be represented in songs or in folk tales, but these stories are passed down. And another part of indigenous religions is that there's an emphasis on experiential type of relationship with it. In other words, it's there to experience, not just to read about or do. So let's look at the three commonalities with indigenous religions. Three things that you're going to find in most indigenous religions, and as always, throughout this entire course, we're going to be making generalities to help you understand things better. But once again, there's always an exception. I had a professor named Dr. Cox. He was my biology professor at Mississippi College. He had a dictum, which he said this was Cox's dictum. And it was that there's an exception to every rule except Cox's dictum. And he thought he was funny because, once again, well, it had an exception within it saying it didn't. Well, there you go. So, there will always be an exception. That being said, let's launch right into a good generalization. That there are three commonalities. The shaman, the totem, the fetish. The shaman. Now, before we get too wild up about it, let's look at what Mr. Dictionary has to say. If you look at the phonetics there, it says shaman, shaman, shaman. In other words, you can pronounce it pretty much however you feel like it. I go for shaman. Why? I don't know, but that's the one I choose. So a shaman is considered to have powers that are more than the normal human possesses. The shaman is considered to understand or treat diseases, and he might even bring a disease onto somebody else. Other words that we use for shaman is, well, a witch doctor or a medicine man. In fact, I was more familiar with those terms than the term shaman before studying for these courses. So what is the job description of a shaman? So if you're going to monsterjobs.com and you're going to want to become the next shaman for a particular group, what are you looking for? Well, in part, you're sort of like a little doctor. You're a doctor of sorts, and he, but it could be a she, not as common, can enter trances to communicate with the spirit world for guidance. Okay? In other words, that's part of that power that they have that other people don't, is that they can communicate with the supernatural. The next thing that we have that's a similarity is called the totem. Most of us, when we hear that word, we think of, well, a totem pole. Well, the totem is an object, and it can be held in high regard and treated like a relative. Even though it's a thing, it's super, super important. This is a very common thing in the American Northwest, and it's also common in Africa. In fact, when I was living in China, I saw things that looked remarkably like totem poles. Even had like intricate details on them. I was always kind of curious, like, how did that happen? So the word totem actually comes from an Ojibwe word, which means my village. And you're going to find out that the totem wasn't just a pretty picture. It actually showed off like who lived there. Hence why, well, it translates to my village. So the totem, it serves as a protector for the family or the tribe. Often the totem, which can be an animal or a plant, it's off limits for consumption. So in other words, whatever that object was, it was so special that they revered it in such a way that they actually protected it in a sort of way that, well, you didn't go and have it for dinner, one thing, but the other is it became a revered part of your life. The next part is in some societies, members of the same totem would not be even allowed to marry each other. So this object is now affecting, well, marriage life. It affects social life. So once again, these things, from an outside observer, it might just be a cute picture that you want to take a picture with. But to the tribe that held it in high regard, well, it affected their daily life. The next part is the fetish. Now, before you start to freak out, the fetish that we're talking about here is this term set up by anthropologists. And it basically means an inanimate object, in other words, something that's not alive and moving, that is held by people to hold magical powers, and sometimes even an independent will. So, many indigenous religions have something that is natural or man-made that is very important. And I have on here, think dreamcatcher or crystal. So, to a Westerner, you probably can be thinking about a rabbit's foot that you bought from a gumball machine at Pizza Hut, which to practitioners of an indigenous religion, it's much more than a trinket, and plus it probably should be mildly disturbing that people can buy a rabbit's foot from a gumball machine at a restaurant, but that's a whole nother story, right? So the fetish is an item that has power, and it's also not a good thing to just mistreat it because, well, it has power in the thing. And I have on here non-fetish fetishes, all right? And this is to kind of maybe help you understand how it's not such a foreign idea. So many religions actually end up having a fetish, even if that faith discourages or forbids having something like a fetish. So here's some different scenarios for you. A person can wear a necklace of a saint for protection. A person has a number that's his lucky number. Another one will place a statue on the roof of their house or in their yard to ward off evil spirits or bad luck. A person might go and grab his or her holy book only when trouble strikes. So these are instances where people are treating something like a fetish, even if that's not what they're calling it.